Okay. Hello everyone. How are you? My name is Zakaria Ahmed Salam. I'm an associate professor in political science department here at Northwestern University, but I am also the director for the Institute for the Study of Islamic Thought in Africa, ISITA, and I'm extremely delighted to welcome you to this first iteration of our new series, ISITA Dialogues. ISITA Dialogues is a series of discussion of new books on Islam in Africa. We selected three books that we think make meaningful interventions in the field. There are a number of the books also have absolutely brought new perspective on Islam in Africa, but we selected these 6 books because we think they are really timely. We've been meaning to discuss the particular book today, the Khōja of Tanzania, since it was first published a few years ago, 2016. But we were not able to be able, oh, I see that the presenter is already sharing his screen. That's good. So that means we're ready. Excellent. I just wanted to introduce Professor Iqbal Akhtar and mention what his talk will be about. So Professor Iqbal Akhtar is an associate professor with a dual appointment in the Department of Religious Studies and Politics and International Relations at Florida International University. He graduated from University of Edinburgh Divinity School back in 2013, and he's now in charge of 2 programs at Florida International University. The first one is the West Indian Ocean Studies program, where he is the research director, and the other one is a unique institute, pretty much like ISITA. It's the Jain Studies program. Did I pronounce the Jain right?
That's
the
right.
Jain.
Yeah, Jainism.
The Jain Studies program. So it's the first of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. So in addition to this book that he will be presenting today, he has published articles on American Muslim identity and East African Khōja historiography, including an article which I like very much, titled Negotiating the Racial Boundaries of Khōja Caste Membership in Late 19th Century Colonial Zanzibar, 1878-1899, into the Journal of African Religions, which is a great journal. I'm a regular reader of that academic journal, which is partly funded by our former colleagues here at Northwestern University, Professor Sylvester Johnson. So this paper is that paper is about mixed race Khōja children, and it discusses inheritance, and it's an incredibly interesting paper, so I recommend it. Today, Professor Akhtar will be talking about the Khōja of Tanzania, Discontinuities of a Postcolonial Religious Identity. It's a very interesting concept. Of postcolonial religious identity is intriguing to many people. But this talk is based on his book, The Khōja of Tanzania, Discontinuities of a Postcolonial Religious Identities, published by Brill Academic Publishers back in 2016. Of course, I recommend to everyone to buy this book, but you need to save a little bit in order to be able to afford it, because it's over $100, or to have your library buy it. The book reconstructs the development of a religious identity among the Khōja, an Indic Muslim merchant caste in East Africa, from their arrival on the Swahili coast in the late 18th century until the turn of the 21st century. So what is interesting about this book is actually uses 4 perspectives. It has contribution in terms of historiography, in terms of politics, linguistics, and ethnology. So it caters to many of you coming from different disciplines, and I let the author go further into more details about his contribution and his book. So without further ado, I would like to ask you to welcome with me Professor Akhtar to ISITA Dialogues. So But before, just I give you the floor, one precision about this. This talk is being recorded. So those of you who don't want to be recorded should let us know through the chat function, using the chat function. Me and Rebecca Shrek is ISITA Associate Director, who is also a co-host for this event. So just send us a note saying that if I want to ask the question, but I don't want to be recorded and don't want to be in the video that will be available on YouTube in a few weeks. So without further ado, Professor Akhtar, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zakaria and Rebecca, for having me. I'm glad that we're finally able to connect. And I see my good friend Noel at Northwestern is also there. So I finished my research. We were in the same Fulbright cohort many years ago in Tanzania. So it's wonderful to see her as well. And for all of you attending, thank you for taking the time out of your day to come and listen to what I have to say about the Khōja community. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be here virtually at Northwestern. So today I'll just be focusing kind of giving you a brief overview of the research that I did, focusing on the history of the Khōja community. And for majority of you, you probably don't know who the Khōja are. So what I'll do is I'll give you a brief overview of the history of the community. And then I kind of want to just touch the main themes and really open it up for discussion, because I think that that's generally the more meaningful and more interesting part of these discussions. So the idea of this being a dialogue, I think, is really important. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Iqbal Akhtar, and as Zakaria pointed out, I'm here at Florida International University in Miami. So I'm director of the Indian Ocean Studies program here, and also the Jain Studies program. So Jainism, for those of you who don't know, is a minority Indic religious tradition that evolved around the same time as Buddhism. And so my work really kind of straddles the two. And that's kind of the way that I have structured this presentation. It's really kind of a dialogue and kind of thinking about Tanzania and the Khōja community as part of a network across the Indian Ocean, a connection and a dialogue between Asia and Africa over millennia, rather than seeing these as discrete parts of the world, you know, kind of in the traditional area studies model that is used in the United States. So this is the book, as Zakaria was saying. It's a little pricey because it's at Brill, so hopefully your library can get it for you. And part of the reason why I ended up publishing it at Brill is because I did much more sort of in-depth philological work, which was not necessarily of interest here in the United States. So I think Brill was a much better place, and I did my doctorate in Europe as well. So I think that helped. So just to give you a sense of who the Khōja are, so the Khōja are a caste community, and I think that's something that's very important to think about, that the community is endogamous, right? So what is a caste, right? So these are social units that develop in South Asia. They generally are endogamous, which means that you marry within the community. Generally, there's a profession that is associated with that community, and the community has generally its own traditions, sort of maybe perhaps dialect, gods that are associated with it as well, right? And so the Khōja is a community that develops in late modernity, so we'd say about the 16th century or so, in a part of South Asia, spanning from Punjab into Sindh and Gujarat. So kind of mostly what's now Pakistan, and then kind of parts of Eastern India as well. And the Khōja community, even though they are now considered to be a Muslim community, their origin comes from older, what now we would term to be Hindu. And part of the reason that I am putting these words in inverted commas or brackets is because these terminologies of being Hindu or Muslim are really sort of, you know, colonial constructs in terms of when we look at sort of this medieval period, it was much more fluid in which, and when we look at the Khōja and we think about the Khōja, they were actually doing multiple traditions, right? So even though they were doing, you know, the Azadar of Imam Hussein and Shia traditions, they were marrying according to Sunni rites. They were also doing puja according to Hindu rites, right? So there was a lot of sort of intermixing of these traditions. And then of course, it was connected to local saints as well, Muslim saints, right? So when we're thinking about the religion, what we're really thinking about is Indic religion, which has the capacity to incorporate other religious traditions, right? In the same way that, you know, Christianity was not necessarily, as the missionaries were not very successful in in South Asia compared to Korea. Why is that? Because Indic religions had the capacity to be able to incorporate new gods as part of the tradition, and didn't necessarily need that exclusivity. So really the origins of sort of early Khōja Islamic tradition is really thinking about, there's a very good book that's just come out by a colleague of mine that focuses on Muhammad as avatar, right? And really by Aisha Irani. I would encourage you to check it out. But really, when we're thinking about Islam in this period, Allah is not the monotheistic God. Allah is added to the pantheon of gods. Muhammad is brought into the pantheon of avatars as another spiritual power. So these are narratives, these are powers that are brought into it. And then when the British come, they basically then say, okay, well, you can't be Hindu and Muslim at the same time. You got to choose, because your inheritance is kind of a bit mixed up. Everything is too mixed up. We need to create these discrete identities. You can't choose Hindu and Muslim on the census at the same time, right? And we see adjudication through inheritance cases and things like that help to sort of separate these out, right? And so really what you see is kind of the development of Khōja as a caste identity, and eventually over time becoming more, we should say, Islamized, right? So the community, the part of the Khōja community that I focus on are called the Ithnashari Khōja, or now they're known as the Twelvers, or the schism within the Khōja that saw itself as being part of the Twelver Shia tradition. So this is a map of Khōja communities, and it's by no means is it comprehensive, but it gives you an idea of the Khōja merchant communities set up all throughout the Indian Ocean littoral, from Siam all the way to the Cape Colony in what's now South Africa, right? So the communities really by the late 18th, early 19th century were kind of moving out of South Asia and developing permanent communities, trading communities, all throughout the Indian Ocean region. And of course, the colonization of this part of the world actually helped to facilitate the development of economic regimes in terms of the export of raw materials from East Africa, and then the importing of finished materials from South Asia and different parts of the Indian Ocean world. So my interest really is kind of trying to understand who are the Khōja, and kind of how has their identity shifted over the course of 2 centuries being in East Africa, right? So I talked about earlier about sort of the religious history of the community. It was kind of a mixture of many different traditions, and over time, using manuscripts, epigraphy, oral history. So I use kind of mixed methodologies in order to understand kind of the development of who the Khōja are. And what we see is that the Khōja develop, there are 2 kind of major events that take place. One is the arrival of the Aga Khan, and then the schism of the Khōja, in which you have the Ismaili Khōja, known as sort of the Aga Khan faction. Then you have the Ithnashari community, you have the Sunni community, and then also a reaction against and a redefinition of Khōja identities actually being Hindu. And so there are communities that actually say, actually, we're not Muslim at all, we're actually Hindu. And then going with the Arya Samaj, Swami Narayan, and sort of the other sort of modernist Hindu movements. And so you see sort of how complex this identity is in the colonial moment. And then what ends up happening is that depending on where the Khōja are across the Indian Ocean littoral, being under Francophone rule or being under Anglophone rule really shifts the way that you think about your identity. So being under Anglophone rule means that you associate more with your religious identity. And because of laïcité in the French system, you actually de-emphasize religious identity and emphasize more strongly sort of ethnic identity as well, and particularly Indic identity. Right, so the schism is very important because the schism really thinks about, and it really talks about kind of how authority was constructed and reconstructed across the Indian Ocean littoral. So really the big question in the 19th century happens is when the first Aga Khan comes from Persia to South Asia and eventually to Bombay. And he says that in your text, there is the belief that there is a Messiah that will come. Right, a kind of a messianic figure, a kind of an imam that would sort of lead you, and that awaited person is me in the form of the Aga Khan. And so the resources and everything that you've invested in the name of this person actually belong to me. right? And this creates massive sort of tension within the community and a schism that ends up reverberating from South Asia all the way across the Indian Ocean littoral, right? And so the question then really becomes, who are the Khoja? What is their religion? Because based on what their religion is, then the claim of the Aga Khan is either validated or invalidated. And so the British courts then really are going deeper into this question: who are the Khoja? Where do they come from? And really, what we see is that in the colonial and British India, the British colonies of India, the British courts side on the side of the Aga Khan, right? And so really the majority of the Khoja end up identifying themselves as Ismaili. Now, what's very interesting is that in East Africa and sort of the Western Indian Ocean littoral, it ends up being evenly split between the Ithna Ashari and the Ismaili, or in certain places like in Muscat, in Mogadishu, and other places, the vast majority of people convert to Ithna Ashari identity among the Khoja, and the Ismailis are sort of excommunicated, right? Whereas in sort of South Asia, the majority become Ismaili and the minority Sunni and Ithna Ashari are excommunicated from the tradition, right? And so the question is sort of, why does this happen? Why is it that in certain parts of East Africa, the Ithna Ashari faction dominates, in South Asia, the Ismaili, the faction dominates? And I'll talk about that and explain that in a little bit. So this is the firman, the natbar, or the sort of the outcasting firman, really. So what ends up happening is that the community, and it's important to kind of explain this, because the caste communities were not just places where you had endogamous religion, but the caste was critical in an age and in an area where there existed basically no institutions, right? So there's no real banking structure in East Africa in the 19th century, right? There's no credit union. There are basically no major institutions in a Western sense that we would understand in terms of a dispensary or things like that, right? So really the Khoja then being part of a caste community means not only do you marry among them, but you have access to credit. You have access to schools, you have access to pharmacies. So being part of that community is absolutely critical for your success, right? And so the outcasting was kind of a major way of signaling who is in, who is out, who has access to resources, who doesn't have access to resources. And so here is sort of the firman from the third Aga Khan, Sultan Muhammad Shah, sort of outcasting sort of the other communities, and particularly the Ithna Ashari, who were the largest community. The Sunni, for the most part, had left, and they're a small minority, but it's really sort of between the Ithna Ashari and the Ismaili community. So this is the firman. In a section of it says, you don't have any business with anyone else's religion. Your duty is to those who do not give their allegiance to the Ithna Ashari. No daughter should be given to them. You cannot attend their marriages, don't attend their funerals, don't eat from them, don't entertain with them, or interact with them socially if in any way. If you must meet with them for purposes of business, only talk about those matters and nothing else. I trust that the community should hear and observe this, and those who disobey then are stained with the black ink, right? And this is referring to a register of the members of the community, right? And we see this continued, right? So one of the things that's kind of important about the Khoja as well is that because they're a merchant community, because they have a very strong relationship with the British sort of colonial administration, they end up absorbing sort of a type of identity that ends up being sort of corporatized, right? So they end up creating their own constitution, they create their own rules, right? The types of sort of modern legal sort of structures that exist for businesses among sort of the colonial regime ends up being adopted by the community. So the caste itself then adopts the forms of a modern corporation, right? And then sort of membership and being part of that corporation then has sort of legal ramifications in terms of how disputes are dealt with sort of within the community itself. And here you see sort of a rule book from Pune in 1914 talking about kind of who's in, who's out with regards to the community. We see that continuing in Africa, in Burma as well, and then particularly sort of in terms of what are the types of identities that you can have, right? So very clearly from the Ismaili perspective, the Imam is Hazar Imam, where he's become present. And so he needs to be celebrated. So sort of the morning of Muharram and Karbala signals a different type of Shi'ism. That's not necessarily something that would be accorded sort of a high status in the way that it is among the Bohra or other Ithnashri communities. Right, and so what we see is sort of this schism that takes place within the community, and the schism itself then helps to develop sort of the new sort of koja identity. So of course, as you can see, that the schism is extremely traumatic for the Ithnashri koja, and it's that trauma of being excommunicated, of children being thrown out of their homes, of not being able to be part of institutions that existed, that helped to create sort of a new type of identity that's independent of and takes a different trajectory from the Ismaili koja. So whereas the Ismaili koja then take kind of a westernizing turn in terms of their corporate identity and particularly religious identity and religious authority, the Ithnashri koja takes sort of an eastward turn, and they look to Iran and the development of global pan-Shiism as part of how they construct their own religious identity, as Khoja Indic identity sort of declines in authority and interest by the community. Right, and kind of that's what you see, is that sort of what happens among the Ismaili koja is that the focus is on particularly sort of with what happens in post-colonial East Africa, right? So I mean, the most famous, of course, is the expulsion by Idi Amin in 1972 of all the Indic communities from Uganda. And so you have a series of, you have a civil war in Mozambique, you have the disintegration of Somalia. So you have a series of kind of essentially post-colonial disasters in East Africa, in which then the majority of the community then is sort of encouraged to go westward into Canada, into sort of Western Europe and North America. And so there you see kind of, again, the modernization and westernization of Ismaili koja identity through organizations like the Aga Khan Development Network and those sorts of institutions. Now, one of the things that I'm interested in is thinking about language and how language and script itself, and that's something that's kind of, a lot of times linguists are not very interested in script. I'm very interested in script because I think that script is a very important marker of identity. So here we see the Kochki script, and so the Khoja as a caste community actually have their own script. So before the British arrived in the 19th century, there were, for instance, for the Sindhi language, there are more than 20 different scripts. So the Memons, Lohana, Bhatia, each of the different caste communities have their own sort of way of writing. And really the script evolves for two reasons. One is they're merchant communities, so you have to be able to create ledgers, receipts, things like that. And the second reason that the script develops is to note in this sort of mercantile shorthand religious texts, right? So these become mnemonics, so that when you recite texts, you are able to read them, or people who have the capacity to be able to read, right? So this script is actually just for the Khoja community, right? So each of the communities develop their own sort of version of the script that can be read by the community. So it's kind of insular and is really kind of focused on containing the knowledge of the community for future generations, right? And so we see a manuscript in Kochki of a Majlis of Hussein, and also a manuscript that talks about the namaz and sort of how to say the salah or the daily prayer, right? And so what ends up happening, I think, with the Khoja is that the Khoja corpus, we could say, of religious texts, which range from Indic prayers known as the Ginans or duas like the Gatpat dua, all the way to marsias and nohas of the Shia tradition, this entire large corpus of religious materials that ends up being divided up by the community, right? So the Ismaili community, for instance, continues the Ginan tradition, whereas the Ithnashri community continues the noha or the poems that focus on the martyrdom of Hussein, right? So you really have the division of the corpus of materials within sort of the Kochki sort of within these Kochki texts, right? Which are important. So one of the things that's also important to understand is that as the Khōja go into diaspora, so when we look at that map that showed the Khōja community in the year 1899, the vast majority of, when we think of diaspora theory, right? Diaspora theory, for the most part, focuses on a homeland or a supposed homeland, and then people in some sort of way being alienated from that homeland, or not being able to go back to the homeland, or dreaming of the homeland. And what's unique about the Khōja is that they don't have that desire, that being in the subcontinent, being in India or Pakistan, there's no desire to go back. So the ones that are in East Africa don't necessarily want to go to India and Pakistan. And we see this especially with the exodus, right? For instance, I mean, it's visibly in 1972 when Idi Amin expels all the Asians. The vast majority of Asians don't want to go to India. They don't want to go to Pakistan. And India under Nehru was very clear. It's the British responsibility to take care of the Asians, and they eventually then end up going to Western Europe and particularly to the UK, right? So they don't have a nostalgic idea. And part of the reason why that nostalgia doesn't exist, I would argue, is because they were Muslim for the most part. The vast majority of Muslims really indigenized themselves to an extent within East Africa, and particularly for the Zanzibari community, they really adopted Kiswahili as their main language. So their entire generation of people brought up in East Africa who didn't know Gujarati or any of the Indic languages very well, and Kiswahili was their main language, right? So that was kind of one of the shifts that takes place. Whereas, for instance, when we look at the history of the Jains or the history of or Hindus, right? India is part of a spiritual imaginary. And it's important because sort of the spiritual universe of Indic religions is the subcontinent, is India. Or sort of, what we consider the sort of the subcontinent. And so sort of the Islamic nature of how Khōja identity emerges allows a different type of indigenization. And so what that means then is that the Jamaat, or the community of the Khōja, ends up serves as a proxy for the homeland. So the homeland can be taken anywhere, and so the community then migrates in these migratory patterns, right? So in the United States, it would be a place like Orlando, it would be a place like New York City, right? Los Angeles, right? So you move in mass to a community, set up a community, and then that community, the caste hall, the Jamaat Khana, the Imam Bardo, the mosque, then ends up serving and really kind of becoming a homeland. That's the community essentially. So you really then are able to create these portable homelands all across the world. And of course, that's extremely helpful in the age of globalization, where people, resources, ideas, services are able then to move across borders very, very quickly, right? And having multiple passports also allows you the ability to do that. So I think that also, what's important also is then to think about sort of development as well. So the Khōja are not simply a caste community that's interested purely in its own economic success, but it's a deep ethos of what's called seva, or service to the community, right? And for the most part, that means developing institutions that are world class and available to everybody. So for instance, when we look at the best hospital, for instance, in Dar es Salaam or in Tanzania, it's the Aga Khan Hospital in Dar es Salaam, which is a Khōja institution developed and supported by the Smiley Culture, right? And so we see this pattern in South Asia and other places, right? So this idea of seva and service to other people is something that's very important. Now for the Smiley Culture, the idea of tabligh is not important. So you still see this sort of idea of a caste consciousness in a different way, and sort of incorporating new Ismaili communities into sort of a more bounded identity. For the Ithnashri Khōja then, with the influence of Iran and sort of being connected to the larger sort of Shia, the Pan-Shia community, we see the development of tabligh and particularly the largest community of African Shia, of Black African Shia, through the Bilal Muslim mission throughout East Africa, right? So that's kind of one of the ways that we see kind of a difference between the Ithnashri Khōja and the Smiley Khōja in terms of how they integrate and interpret their sort of pan-Islamic identity. And so that's kind of one of the things that I wanted to kind of just really highlight, I think, that which is kind of the core idea behind the the presentation is really this idea that we have a development, right, from an Indic Islamic religious tradition to sort of more normative Islam. And through that, you're losing vernacular forms of Islam, and you're adopting larger and sort of and larger forms of Islam through language. So as your language expands from Kutchi to Gujarati, Gujarati to Swahili, Swahili to English, each of these transitions in language across generations opens you up to new types of identities and new discourses that you didn't have in the sort of the smaller caste identity. And so what we see is over the course of 2 centuries, an expansion of the caste identity, both an expansion and also a maintenance of the caste property, wealth, and sort of endogamy as well. Right, so we see this as sort of the linguistic shift. So just to kind of show you, the Bohra community is another community that's very similar in its structure to the Khōja. And so they actually were writing Gujarati with Arabic script. So this is kind of one of the few examples that we have of early forms of Gujarati being written in the Arabic script. Of course, a lot there was quite a bit of material, but access to that material is more difficult. And so we see sort of sort of the interplay between the 2 languages. So as we talked about earlier, you have the Khōja script. Now, what ends up happening is that with the advent of the printing press, again, the British then choose certain scripts to represent the languages. So the Khōja script for writing Sindhi, for instance, is lost because the British end up privileging 2 scripts. The modified Arabic script, which is now the script that Sindhi is written in, and the Khudabadi, which is a modified script for Hindu merchants that ends up sort of really dying out and never really being adopted for a variety of reasons, in addition being the partition itself. And so what we see is sort of the community then trying to go from many different dialects, many different even versions of the Khōja. So even we talk about Khōja as a script, it wasn't just one script. It was actually a variety of different scripts that were used by the caste communities across sort of South Asia and across the diaspora, standardized into a typeset that ends up sort of being used in the publication, the printing of Khōja materials. Now, the Ismaili Khōja maintained the Khōja script much longer. The Gujarati, the Kathiawar, the Gujarati speaking, and particularly the Ithnashri community, abandons the script very early on and adopts Gujarati. And so what they end up doing is, as you can see within the Gujarati script, you see new types of diacritics that are created. And these diacritics then are unique to the Khōja, to the Khōja Ithnashri, in being able to transliterate Persian and Arabic phonemes that don't exist in Gujarati, in order to be able to more quickly and transliterate and translate materials from normative Islamic sources into the Gujarati script that ends up becoming the standard for the publication of materials all throughout Gujarat, and then for what ends up becoming Gujarati diaspora communities all across the Indian Ocean region. Of course, we see that the Smiley Culture, then again, between the Ismaili Khōja and Ithnashri Khōja, there is dialogue, even within the printing press. And here you see in the Ismaili Khōja Dua, the adoption of the Ithnashri sort of transliteration system, right? So there is, even though the communities are kind of split, there is still interplay between these communities in terms of their identity, their writings, etc. Right? So I think one of the things that kind of I wanted to highlight, and I know I'm kind of running a little bit late on time, so I'll just kind of finish this pretty quickly, is again, you're losing the vernacular to sort of these larger normative Near Eastern forms of Islam, and kind of what that means for the community trying to maintain an identity in the West, particularly. So what does it mean to be Shia, and what does it mean in Khōja? In East Africa, being Ithnashri Khōja, these things are synonymous. Being Khōja and Ithnashri, for the most part, are synonymous. Khōja and Ismaili are synonymous. When you come into a multicultural environment, like the UK, like the United States, now these identities are much larger. you are coming into a larger American Islamic identity. And so then what does it mean to be Khoja? Means that you have to kind of reread your past in a very different way to be able to understand how to maintain sort of the boundaries, even within sort of a pan-Islamic identity structure. And again, what ends up happening is that with sort of what happens with the kind of the post-colonial disasters in East Africa, I think, you know, with the wars, particularly in the Congo, the majority of the communities end up leaving, and really the 19th century, where the East African Khoja are the vanguard of Khoja identity, and sort of the inventions of marketing, of different types of sort of mercantile practices, of education. All these institutions end up then moving to the West, and sort of the East African community then it consolidates and it then concentrates in a few cities throughout East Africa, like Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, places like that. And so, you know, that's kind of just what I kind of wanted to think about, is kind of how do we think critically about the Khoja within Islamic studies, in which the Near Eastern is not the only sort of form of authoritative, is not the authoritative model by which we are able to understand Islam, but these vernacular forms of Islam also contribute to the complexity of the development of Islam. So that's it. Thanks. Yes, so the Khoja Ithnashari community then develops, what they end up developing is that initially you have these Jamaat structures, which are these community structures that are local, based on, you know, local institutions, kind of the main philanthropists within the community that give. And as I was saying before, one of the things that's important is this idea of seva, or giving to the community. So if you are successful as a Khoja merchant, your reputation is dependent upon the type of philanthropy that you do. It's expected of you that if you're a very wealthy merchant, you're going to take care of the community around you. And it's particularly the poor people within the community. You're going to sponsor communal feasts. You're going to be able to sponsor welfare projects for the community. So that's something that's expected of you. And if you don't do that, your reputation then takes a hit, right? So again, it's a more communal sort of based identity. Eventually then in the mid 20th century, you develop the Africa Federation, which is all of the communities of East Africa figure that, okay, you know what, we can pool our resources, our expertise together. And then beyond that, you have the development in the late 20th century of a World Federation of Khoja communities across East Africa. This takes much more time and is again more decentralized compared to the Smiley Culture, in which the Aga Khan then sort of centralizes power and sort of the narrative across these different communities.
All right.
Yes.
If you have questions, just raise your hand and we'll give you the floor. You can straight away ask your question. I had a question about this. I like this idea of a portable diaspora. So it's actually extremely useful in our, but I was also intrigued how other Africans, especially in Tanzania, and or other Muslims, for example, the Ibaji community in that whole Zanzibar, Tanzania area, how do they look at what kind of relationship they have with the Khoja?
That's a very good question. You have to ask the hard questions. So I think it's complicated. I think the Zanzibar, which is the focus, really I focus on Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar. Zanzibar, they had an exceptional relationship with the Ibadi, you know, with the ruler. Even what was very important for the Khoja is that the day of Ashura, which is sort of, you know, the most important day, you know, one of the most important days for the Shia community, was actually a public holiday during the time of the Sultanate, the Zanzibari Sultanate. Now, what ends up happening, I think that in kind of the way that I framed the blog post as well is, so really what ends up happening is that a new narrative develops, right? Where to be African means that that's associated with a certain type of Blackness, right? And certain groups then are considered to be African, and other groups are considered not to be African, even though, you know, hundreds of years, you know, these people are there. So what ends up happening is the Zanzibar Revolution, all of the people, you know, you have, I don't know, 10,000 Arabs that are killed in the Zanzibar Revolution. It's very bloody, very messy sort of affair. The majority of the community has to leave. So going from, you know, a couple thousand people to like, you know, 50 people left on the island now within the community. So majority of people go to Dar es Salaam. Then during Nyerere's socialism and the Arusha Declaration, the majority of the communities that have property, Indian communities, European communities, are all divested of everything. Everything is taken by the state and nationalized. So I think that the Khōja of East Africa consider themselves African, right? Because their culture, language, and identity and how they relate to each other is very different from the people in India. 200 years away from the subcontinent changes the way that you think, right? So, and not only that, but then the Hindus and the Jains and the Muslims have an exceptionally good relationship with each other compared to, and the Sikhs, compared to what's happening in South Asia, where you have this Hindu-Muslim violence and kind of this, the bifurcation. I would say that, like Tanzanian identity, for instance, has not evolved to the point of multiculturalism. So Europeans, Indians, you know, these Asian communities are not considered to be, are not really considered to be Tanzanian, I think, in a normative way. So even though they have Tanzanian passport, they're not seen as part of Tanzania, and have, until today, a very negative relationship. So they feel that, well, the Indians are only here to extract resources from us. They're not really part of our society. They won't marry our women, that sort of thing. So those are the discourses that Idi Amin sort of introduced, and that continue until today. And we see that, you know, with the Lebanese in West Africa, you know, we see this is not something that's new, right? So any of these merchant communities, the narratives continue, yeah, unfortunately.
You go first.
Well, thank you, Nicole. My name is Ansar. I am in Minneapolis, and I'm originally from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. I'm a Khōja, and then qualify further, I'm a Khōja Shia Nashri. I missed your first part of your talk, and I wonder if I would be able to get the part of it online or somewhere, because I think it is being recorded. Is that correct?
Yes.
So how would I get access to your whole of your talk?
You can always write us afterwards, and we can direct you to the, just send us your email through the chat. But you can also buy the book.
Oh, there is
have more information.
All right. The second question is, I don't know whether did you talk about how the Khojas came into being, which is very interesting to me, because I have heard different versions as to how Hindus were converted to being a Khōja, which was sort of, they were neither Hindus nor Muslims, and then slowly, because they were known as Satpanthis or something like that. So if you can elaborate it on it, I'll appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So so as I was saying before, the Khōja basically, they start to adopt Islamic ideas and Islamic rituals in about the 16th century or so, as the community connects with different types of peers, right? So we have different sort of saints in lower Punjab and upper Sindh, particularly different types of saints. And what ends up happening is that initially they integrate Islamic characters and ideas into their original religion. So the Khōja, as they develop, right? So the background is they're coming from the Lahana, from the Bhatia, even some communities from Beals and other communities. They start to coalesce around these religious leaders, and then also have, again, similar caste functions as merchants, right? So a new identity is developing. So initially then, for instance, when we think about the Prophet Muhammad, or, you know, in the famous text of Das Avatar, Ali, for instance, becomes an avatar, right? So he becomes Kalki avatar, or the 10th avatar of Vishnu, right? So you have the sort of the incorporation of Islamic ideas, power and rituals into existing Indic religious sort of identities and narratives. And then over time, as the British come, then they force a separation. because through inheritance cases, through the census, they basically say you have to choose, are you Hindu or are you Muslim? What is your real identity? And then through that, they reimagine themselves as being Hindu and Muslim through the development of their interaction with the colonial court system.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If there are no raised hands, we can go to the chat and you can. Okay, there is a raised hand. Shane Roberts, go ahead.
Hi, I'm just wondering. We mentioned there's a mention of the connection to the Fatimid dynasty, but at the same time, we're talking about how the Khōja community really started developing in the 15th, 16th century. So I guess I have a hard time seeing how that lines up.
That's a very good question, Shane. Yeah, that's a very good question. Okay, so I think that the development of modern Ismaili identity among the community that is the Aga Khani community, that faction that ends up then branding itself as Nizari Ismaili, and then you have the Bora community as well, the Daudi Bora community, and then all of the different factions of the Bora community, then draw their legitimacy from the fact that they are the inheritors of the Fatimids, right? So they create lineages, and again, I create in the sense that these are narrative texts that are created. So I'm not saying whether they're true or false, whether it's a real connection that goes to the past or not. But what ends up coming out in print is a series of genealogies, and basically showing how either the imams or the dais eventually going all the way back, eventually go back to the Fatimids, and then through the Fatimids eventually go back to the family of the Prophet, right? And so that's how legitimacy is continued. In the same way, for instance, when we think about a Sufi brotherhood, for instance, you would do the same thing, right? So all the great saints of the Sufi brotherhood, the Naqshbandi, all of these different groups, they eventually have these silsilas that go all the way back to the Prophet, right? And it's through that chain that they determine their authority, right? And so that's really what ends up happening with the Ismaili Khōja community and then different Ismaili communities, is that they emphasize a Fatimid identity. And then when we see the development of their architecture, and particularly for the Bora community, the development of neo-Fatimid architecture. So then now the Fatimid mosques, the Bora mosques are recreated in East Africa in a neo-Fatimid architecture, right? So the facades are created, and so that's kind of, you see this development of Fatimid as an identity through which the community's heritage is legitimized, and then also the authority of leadership over the community is through that connection to the past. Yeah.
And if I may, is there any relationship with the Mu'mini line, or is it all Qasimi line with the Ismaili Khōjas?
That I'm not sure. I haven't done as much work on the Ismaili part, so I would have to do more research on that. Yeah, get back to you.
Thank you.
Debojyoti Das.
Hello. I had a very kind of small question with regards to this idea promoted, the idea of multiculturalism, which you said is not very common and not diffused in the East African community. But I was trying to draw your attention, and you are aware of it, about this whole idea of cosmopolitanism, which has emerged in the Indian Ocean region. And how do you see it as a concept vis-a-vis multiculturalism, which is more of a Western concept? And it is rooted within the context of the Indian Ocean region. But if you look at countries like India, if you look at the city of Mumbai, the idea of cosmopolitanism in fact declined after India's independence. So what is the situation in East Africa that I wanted to know, and how does the Khōja community kind of see itself within these idea of cosmopolitan identity in the Indian context?
That's an excellent question, and yeah, absolutely, you're very right about that. I think that in the context of East Africa, the cosmopolitanism, again, it's different, as you rightly said, from Western multiculturalism. So multiculturalism necessarily says that it's based on kind of a Western ideal, the philosophical foundation of which being the individual, and then sort of the individual being able to have equality of different cultures and then interchange between them. So I think cosmopolitanism, from the context of how I understand it in Zanzibar, really was community-based. So here you have different communities that live side by side with each other. There's a certain amount of interaction with them at a cultural level. So like, for instance, in East Africa, it would be the baraza, which would be these stone benches that people would come and hang out and talk to. But then keeping very strict boundaries with regards to marriage, keeping strict boundaries even to an extent for food as well, right? So a lot of times you won't have sort of the eating of food by Hindus and Muslims sort of from each other, right? So you would have that, but linguistically and culturally, and then particularly for political reasons, you would have a banding together, right? And then you would have, of course, businesses as well, right? So then as the community then in the post-colonial period develops a stronger minority identity against sort of a majority, then you have much closer sort of identification of an Asian awareness or an Asian consciousness, Asian African consciousness. And so you see sort of a lot more communication and very little, I mean, there's almost no factionalism or violence, you know, among any of the Indian communities, Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, Jain, whatever it is. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen in South Asia. Like you said, in Mumbai and all these places, really, the Hindu-Muslim divide is so strong that it really starts to cut off any sort of intercourse between these different communities.
Great. We still have 5 minutes and we can take up some questions. If there are no hands raised, you can go straight to the question about the scripts, which is one of your favorite topics to talk about.
Yeah, I do like scripts. I do like scripts.
And also, there is a question about the Khōja considering themselves as Arabs.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. So really, what ends up happening is that the Khōjki script completely declines in East Africa. And what ends up happening is that is replaced by Gujarati, which ends up becoming sort of the main language until the late 20th century. And then by that time, then there's a shift from Gujarati for the Khōja, I'm speaking specifically, to the use of English and now increasingly also Swahili as well. So at least in Tanzania. So Swahili is also being, you know, incorporated more, particularly sort of in outward facing, you know, community, you know, sort of community initiatives, right? But really English then ends up becoming sort of the main language for the community, a little bit of Kutchi and Gujarati among the community at home being spoken. But really for the most part, the language by which any real intellectual discussion that's happening on matters of religion or on matters of communal organization ends up being done in English for the most part. So that's kind of what you have. You have that shift in the dying out of Gujarati. The Hindu and the Jain communities end up keeping Gujarati a bit more. The Sikhs keep Punjabi, of course, because it's not just a profane language, but it's also a sacred language as well. So they end up, because religion is tied to the script, they end up maintaining the language much better. And even when I was learning Gujarati in East Africa, there were no Gujarati language teachers among the Khōja community. I ended up having to go to my teacher Sunita Ben, who was Lahana from the Swaminarayan community, because the Swaminarayan community maintains Gujarati as a language for their religious, you know, communication sort of with their leadership in India. So they maintain it. So really, again, you see this divide in terms of the type of assimilation between Hindus and different various Muslim communities. Yeah. I think I had another question. Yeah, so I think the identity, I think that's kind of one of the things that's happened is that the Indic for the Khōja that end up staying in Oman and in Yemen and other places, they end up sort of, because of Arab identity is also very unique. Arab identity is based in the modern period based on language. So anyone can be an Arab. It doesn't matter what color your skin is, right? It's a language-based sort of identity, a cultural-based identity. And so what ends up happening is that a great deal of assimilation happens in places like Somalia and Oman with Arabs or sort of the majority sort of community, whereas in the Anglophone communities and the Francophone sort of areas of colonization, you still have the maintenance of sort of that identity. In East Africa, Anglophone, they end up de-emphasizing their Indic heritage and say we're Muslim or we're Shia. That's their primary identity. In the Francophone, again, because of laïcité, the Islamic heritage is considered, Islam is considered to be synonymous with Arabs and North Africans who have a lower place on the social hierarchy. And so being Indian is actually very, very important, and sort of highlighting Indic heritage gives you more prestige within sort of the Francophone sort of political realm.
Okay, I'm sure you've asked this question. I'm reserving for myself the last question.
Sure.
The privilege of being the organizer.
Of course.
The question, I think Iqbal is more than happy to take them up. So I think you get this question a lot. How many hojas are there or out there today?
Okay, that's a very good question. So I would say that for the Ithnashari Khōja, the numbers, of course, they're not hard numbers, but they would say 120,000 across the world, and about 50,000 just in South Asia itself, India, Pakistan. So that's kind of where the biggest concentration of the community is. For the Ismaili Khōja, I would say it's much larger, so closer to 1 million. And then the Ismaili Khōja, of course, have now developed a pan-Ismaili identity in which Tajiks and Syrians and other communities. So I would say, I don't know exactly the numbers, but anyone ranging, from 1 million to 5 or 10 million, I think, of Ismailis under the aegis of the Aga Khan.
I think there is a question on Africanization and Idi Amin's policies. I think you already addressed that. You said that the pressure from Idi Amin, that the policies led many Khoja to migrate to UK.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I think really what ends up happening is that Idi Amin, sort of the socialism in East Africa, the violence in Mogadishu, and in Somalia and in Mozambique, the revolution in Zanzibar, basically what ends up happening is that the Khojas who are of a professional class, people who had the capacity to speak English, who had some sort of degrees and stuff like that, they ended up leaving earlier when migration to the West was much easier in the 60s and 70s. And then what ends up happening is the people that have less capacity to leave end up leaving sort of the interior of these places and then coalesce in the main cities. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we can take one last question.
Sajjad Jan Mohammed. I'm a Khōja from Dar es Salaam originally. Right now I'm in California. And my question to Professor Iqbal is there a communication between the various Khōja communities, for example, between the Ithnasharis and the Ismailis, in terms of any sort of interaction at this point?
Very good question. Very salient, because at FIU we've developed, with the World Federation of the Khōja Ithnashari community, we've developed a Khōja studies as kind of a subfield of study within Islamic studies. And we've had about 2 conferences already. So the first one was in Paris, the second one was in Mumbai. And it's with sort of the French Institute for South Asian Studies, the National Research Lab in Paris, CNRS. And so that's kind of been the first time, I think, that at an academic level, the Sunni, the Ithnashari, and the Ismaili Khojas have started now to communicate and trying to work through the development of their own history, and trying to figure out kind of how to piece it together with the different types of sort of oral knowledge that each of the communities took as the schism took place. So it's beginning at an academic level, absolutely.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. Appreciate that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Excuse me, may I remind you of my chat question?
Okay, yes. Okay, that's a good question. So this is a very good question. So the Khōja community in Oman are also known by the name Lawati. and that tends to be the name that the community now goes by, the Khōja ethnocentric community. And of course, because of the way that Arab identity has developed in Oman, they don't necessarily want to be connected with the Khōja community, and have actually created their own self-narrative of them actually being Arabs in origin. But yes, during the British colonial period and during the census and sort of other types of colonial correspondence, the Khōja Lawati community would have also been subsumed under the heading of Hindu minority. That's right. Yeah. So Hindu was actually, because of their identity and relationship, they would, we've seen a lot of colonial correspondence, the Khōjas being linked into sort of Hindu merchants as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you for a good question.
All right.
Are there any more questions? No? All right, so that's all the time we have, unfortunately. So I would recommend trying to get your hands on that book because it's extremely rich and thick in terms of data analysis, and it's also multidisciplinary, which is like, even though there is a huge emphasis on linguistics as you might suspect from this presentation. So on that, please join me in thanking Professor Iqbal Akhtar for his presentation on the Khōja in Tanzania. And I would give you, our next talk will be April 21st. And this time we'll be discussing Alexander Thurston's latest book on jihadism in North Africa and the Sahel. So until then, thank you very much for attending this presentation, and have a good day or good night, depending on where you are.
Thank you, Zakaria. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much.